To entertain his bored friends, a wealthy CEO makes a disgusting bet on a homeless woman. He thinks he's in control of the game. He doesn't realize he's just a pawn in her much more complex and life-altering lesson on the true meaning of wealth. Like this video, and right where you're watching us from, we will be happy to send you our regards. The air on the 95th floor of the Chicago skyscraper was as thin and refined as the men who breathed it. We were kings of the city, or so we believed, looking down at the glittering tapestry of lights below, as if it were our own personal kingdom, a map of our success. The smoke from our expensive cigars curled toward the vaulted ceiling of the exclusive club, its scent mingling with the aroma of aged bourbon and the quiet, corrosive smell of our own boredom. I am Darius, and my world was built of luxury cars, lucrative deals, and the hollow, echoing silence of a life without challenge. My success, the string of high-end dealerships I owned, was a testament to my ambition, but it had become a gilded cage, and my soul was rattling against its bars. "I'm bored," I said, the words a familiar refrain in our weekly gatherings. I swirled the bourbon in my heavy crystal glass. Every deal is the same. Every woman is the same. Every day is the same. Leon, my oldest friend and a man who had made his fortune in the high-stakes gamble of real estate development, let out a low, predatory chuckle. "Then we need a new game, my friend," he said, his eyes gleaming with the familiar, dangerous light of a man who thrives on chaos. "A game with real stakes. Something to remind us we're alive." Kevin, the cautious one, the financial wizard who managed all of our money, shifted uncomfortably in his leather armchair. "I don't like the sound of this, Leon." "Of course you don't," Leon scoffed. "You like predictable returns. I prefer a bit of volatility." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew us all in. He pointed a manicured finger towards the vast floor-to-ceiling window. Far below, in the harsh, sodium-orange glow of a streetlight, a small, hunched figure was moving through an alleyway, digging through the trash bins behind a Michelin star restaurant. It was a woman, her form made genderless and ancient by a cocoon of rags. "I bet you," Leon said, his eyes fixed on the pathetic scene below. $3 million. That you, Darius, with all your charm and your expensive suits, cannot convince that woman to spend the night with you." A shocked silence fell over our table. Ray, the lawyer, the one who was supposed to be our moral compass, actually choked on his drink. "Leon, that's disgusting," he managed to sputter. "Exactly." Leon grinned, his teeth a white slash in the dim light. "It's a challenge of pure skill. No one can say he's using his money or his looks. This is about pure persuasion, against all odds. Darius here thinks he can have any woman he wants. Let's see if that includes the ones the world has thrown away." The challenge was grotesque. It was cruel. And a dark, shameful part of me, the part that was suffocating from the sheer, predictable luxury of my life, felt a jolt of adrenaline it hadn't felt in years. It was a question of pride. My reputation as a smooth, irresistible operator was on the line. But more than that, it was a break from the suffocating boredom. "You're on," I said, my voice a low growl. "But let's make it interesting. My $3 million against your $1 million each. If I win, I take all three of yours." Leon's grin widened. "Deal." He extended his hand, and we shook on it, sealing the ugly, cynical pact. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my custom-tailored suit. As I walked towards the private elevator that would take me from this pinnacle of wealth down to the cold, dirty reality of the alley below, Leon called out after me. "Remember, Darius, voluntary consent only." I didn't turn back. I was already in the game, a predator descending from my perch, on my way to claim my prey. The descent from the 95th floor was a journey between worlds. The private elevator, all polished brass and dark, gleaming mahogany, moved with a silent, frictionless speed. As I watched the floor numbers decrease, I felt a familiar, predatory thrill. This was no different from closing a difficult deal or pursuing a reluctant woman. It was a game of power, of leverage, of identifying a target's weakness and exploiting it for my own gain. I rehearsed my lines in my head. I would be compassionate, a kind benefactor offering a moment of respite to a woman down on her luck. I would be a gentleman, treating her with a disarming respect that would lower her guard. I felt a surge of arrogant confidence. This would be easy. The $3 million was as good as in my bank account. The elevator doors opened not into the grand perfumed lobby, but into a private, sterile service exit that led directly to the back alley. The transition was jarring. The warm, climate-controlled air of my world was replaced by the damp, chilly breath of the Chicago night. The scent of bourbon and leather was instantly erased by the sour, cloying smell of wet garbage and diesel fumes. I stepped out onto the cracked, uneven pavement under the harsh, flickering glare of a single security light. The city I had just been admiring from my throne now felt alien and hostile. The alley was a canyon of brick and steel, its walls stained with grime, its floor littered with the detritus of the city's excess. This was the world my friends and I looked down on, the world we paid a great deal of money to never have to touch. And there she was. Up close, she was even more of a caricature of poverty than she had appeared from above. She was enveloped in layers of mismatched, filthy clothing, a man's oversized tweed coat over a stained cardigan, a tattered scarf wrapped around her head. Her hands, as they methodically sorted through the contents of a ripped trash bag, were caked with a grime so deep it looked like a second skin. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the smell, and approached, my expensive hand-stitched leather shoes making a soft, incongruous sound on the gritty pavement. "Good evening," I began, my voice a smooth, practiced baritone, the voice I used to close deals and open doors. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She did not startle. She did not look up immediately. She finished placing a collection of aluminum cans into a plastic bag, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she straightened up, a painful-sounding crack coming from her back, and she turned to face me. Her face was a roadmap of a hard life, a canvas of deep-set wrinkles and smudges of dirt. But her eyes were not what I had expected. They were not the dull, vacant eyes of a person beaten down by life. They were a pale, startling blue, and they were as sharp, as clear, and as intelligent as anyone I had ever met in a boardroom. Those eyes took me in, from my perfectly styled hair to my polished shoes, with a look of cool, weary assessment. "What's the matter, handsome?" she asked, her voice a low, gravelly rasp, but with no trace of the deference or fear I had anticipated. "Lose your way to the front door?" The question, so direct, so utterly unimpressed, threw me off my game. "No, I was looking for you," I stammered, my carefully rehearsed lines suddenly feeling foolish and inadequate. "For me?" A dry, rattling laugh escaped her lips. "I doubt that. People look past me. They look through me. But they don't look for me." She leaned against the brick wall, crossing her arms over her chest, her posture one of amused, insolent curiosity. "So, what is it? Feeling guilty after your $1,000 steak? Want to give me a $20 bill to feel like a good Christian before you go home to your penthouse?" She gestured with her head towards the glittering spire of my building. "Or," she said, her voice dropping, her pale eyes narrowing with a terrifying perceptiveness, "did you and your friends up there in your glass tower get bored? Did you make some kind of stupid rich boy bet, and I'm the prize?" The blood rushed to my face. A hot, prickling wave of shame and embarrassment washed over me. She had seen through it all. The suit, the smooth voice, the entire pathetic charade. In an instant, she had stripped me of all my power, of all my advantage. I was not the predator, the man in control. I was a foolish, arrogant boy who had been caught playing a cruel and childish game. I was speechless. "I thought so," she said with a humorless chuckle. To my own surprise, I found myself desperate to regain some semblance of dignity, not by lying further, but by admitting the truth. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There was a bet." "And what was it?" she asked, her tone now like a doctor's, a clinical, detached curiosity. "That you could get me to—" "What?" "Shine your shoes? Dance a jig? Or something a little more ambitious?" "Something more ambitious," I admitted, my shame now complete. I reached into my jacket, but not for a $20 bill. I pulled out my entire money clip, a thick wad of $100 bills. "This is $10,000, I said, my voice gaining a new, steadier tone. I was no longer playing Leon's game. I was playing my own. "The bet is lost. You saw to that the moment you opened your mouth. But now, I'm curious." I extended the money to her. $10,000, not for the bet, but for a few hours of your time. Dinner, conversation, in my home. No other expectations. She looked at the money, then back at me, her sharp eyes weighing me up, assessing this new, unexpected offer. "You're a strange one, handsome," she said after a long moment. She reached out a grimy hand and took the money, stuffing it deep into the pocket of her coat. "All right," she said. "You've bought my time. But first, I'm going to need a shower that's hot enough to scald the devil." The ride up in the Bentley was silent and surreal. The doorman in the lobby of my building, a man who was accustomed to a parade of supermodels and socialites, looked as if he was about to have a stroke as I, Darius Kane, escorted this filthy, tattered woman towards the private elevator. The power dynamic had been completely and utterly inverted. I had come down to the alley to play a game, believing I was the one in control. But as we ascended in silence back to my penthouse, I had the distinct and unsettling feeling that I was no longer the player. I was the game. My penthouse, a space I had meticulously designed to be a monument to my own success, had never felt so cold and empty. It was a sprawling two-story expanse of glass, steel, and Italian marble, filled with modern art I had bought but never truly seen, and furniture that was more beautiful to look at than to sit on. It was less a home and more a gallery, and the sole exhibit was me. As Martha, my strange and unnerving guest, walked through it, she did so not with the wide-eyed awe of a tourist, but with the cool, appraising eye of a critic. She ran a hand over a marble countertop, her touch light and assessing. "A whole lot of space for one man," she observed, her gravelly voice echoing in the cavernous living room. "Must get lonely up here, with nothing but the ghosts of your own good taste for company." Her words were a direct hit, a casual, almost lazy jab that landed with the force of a body blow. She was right. The place was lonely. It was a gilded cage, and I rattled around in it, filling the silence with meaningless parties and a parade of beautiful, forgettable women. She saw it instantly. The thought was deeply unnerving. I showed her to the master guest suite, a room larger than most city apartments, with a bathroom clad in floor-to-ceiling black marble. "The bathroom is through there," I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. "You'll find everything you need. Towels, robes. Take your time." She gave me a long, unreadable look, her pale eyes seeming to see right through me. "Don't you worry, handsome," she said with that same dry, humorless chuckle. "After the week I've had, I plan on taking all the time in the world." She closed the door, leaving me alone in the vast, silent expanse of my own life. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city, a glittering, indifferent jewel spread out below. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to the group chat with Leon, Kevin, and Ray. "The Eagle has landed," I typed, the words feeling childish and absurd. "Get the money ready." Leon replied instantly with a series of laughing emojis. They thought this was still their game. They had no idea. An hour passed, then another. The silence from the guest suite was absolute. I paced the length of my living room, a growing sense of unease creeping over me. What was she doing in there? I ordered food from the city's most expensive restaurant, a feast of oysters, steak, and lobster, an absurdly opulent meal that now felt less like a celebration and more like a desperate attempt to reassert my own wealth, my own control over the situation. Finally, just as the food was being delivered by a private courier, the door to the guest suite opened. She emerged, and the transformation was both subtle and staggering. She was still an old woman. Her face was still a roadmap of wrinkles, her body still frail beneath the thick, luxurious terry cloth of my robe. There had been no pretty woman miracle, but the woman who stood before me was a different person. The layers of dirt and grime were gone, revealing a pale, clear skin. Her matted gray hair was now clean, soft, and tied back in a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. With the filth washed away, The fine, aristocratic lines of her bone structure were suddenly visible, but the most profound change was in her presence. She stood straighter. Her movements were imbued with a quiet, deliberate grace. The woman from the alley had been a survivor, hunched against the world. This woman, this clean, clear-eyed woman in my home, was something else entirely. She was a person of substance. "Well now," she said, her voice sounding smoother, the gravelly rasp softened. "That's better." She walked into the living room, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor, and surveyed the feast I had ordered. "Oysters," she noted with a wry smile. "A bit of a cliché for a seduction, don't you think, Darius?" She knew my name. I had never told it to her. She must have seen it on the mail on my hall table. Of course she had. This woman, I was beginning to realize, missed nothing. "What kind of music do you like?" I asked, fumbling with the tablet that controlled the Penthouse's sound system, desperate to fill the silence. I scrolled through a generic, inoffensive pop playlist. She shook her head. No. Nothing like that." She walked over and looked at the tablet, her eyes scanning the vast library. "Ah," she said, her finger tapping the screen with a surprising deftness. "There we are." A moment later, the cool, complex, and deeply intelligent notes of John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" began to fill the room. The music was like her, sophisticated, soulful, and utterly unexpected. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the saxophone wash over her. "Now," she said, opening them again. "That's more like it." We sat and ate, the glittering city our silent companion. And she began to talk. Or rather, she began to ask questions. Simple, direct, and deeply unsettling questions that no one had ever dared to ask me before. "These paintings," she said, gesturing to a massive abstract canvas on the wall. "Do you like it? Or did someone just tell you it was a good investment?" "This view," she mused, looking out the window. "Do you ever feel like you're a king looking down on your subjects? Or do you just feel separate?" "Tell me, Darius," she asked, her pale eyes fixing on me. "What is the last thing you did that wasn't for money, or for pride, or for the benefit of a game?" I had no answers. Her questions were like a series of gentle, probing scalpels, expertly cutting through the layers of my arrogance and my wealth, laying bare the profound and terrifying emptiness that lay at the core of my life. I was the richest, most successful man I knew, and I was sitting in my palace, feeling like the poorest, most spiritually bankrupt man in the world. And my teacher, my confessor, was a woman who, just a few hours ago, had been digging through the city's trash for her dinner. The John Coltrane music, a river of complex, soulful sound, filled the empty spaces of my penthouse, and for the first time, the room felt alive, inhabited by something more than just the echo of my own wealth. The dinner, a feast that would have normally been a symbol of my status, was transformed into a classroom, and I was the sole, humbled student. Martha, I had to keep reminding myself that her name was Martha, ate with a slow, deliberate appreciation that was a form of silent prayer. She held the wineglass with an easy, practiced grace, swirling the deep red liquid, inhaling its aroma before taking a small, thoughtful sip. Every gesture, every movement, was imbued with a quiet, unshakable dignity that was utterly at odds with the rags she had been wearing just a few hours before. My world, a world built on the simple, brutal metrics of profit and loss, of conquest and acquisition, had no framework for this woman. I had brought her here as a pawn in a cynical game, a piece to be moved on a board of my own design. But she was not a pawn. She was the one controlling the game, and she was doing it not with power or with money, but with a quiet, piercing wisdom that was beginning to dismantle my entire reality, brick by brick. After we had eaten, she looked out at the glittering panoramic view of the city. "You know," she said, her voice a soft, gravelly murmur, "from up here, the city looks like a beautiful, perfect machine. All the lights are on. Everything seems to be working." She paused, taking another sip of wine. "But when you're down there, on the street, You learn that for every light that's on up here, there's a shadow it casts down below. And in those shadows, there's a whole other city, an invisible city. She began to tell me about that city. She spoke not of her own suffering, but of the lives of others, painting a series of vivid, heartbreaking portraits with her words. She told me about a man named Samuel, a former high school history teacher who now slept under a bridge, a man who had lost his home, his career, and his family after a mountain of medical debt from his wife's cancer had consumed them all. He still quotes Shakespeare, she said with a sad smile. He just does it to the pigeons now. She told me about a young woman named Maria, a runaway who had fled an abusive home in another state, a girl with the brilliant, terrified eyes of a trapped animal, who survived by the fierce, protective grace of the older women on the street. Her stories were not pleas for pity. They were simple, unvarnished testaments to the humanity that thrived in the places I had spent my entire life trying not to see. She spoke of the quiet acts of kindness, of a shared cigarette, of a half-eaten sandwich given to someone hungrier than yourself. She described an economy that ran not on dollars, but on favors, on trust, on the shared, unspoken understanding of what it meant to have nothing but the clothes on your back and the story of how you had gotten there. As I listened, a profound and deeply uncomfortable transformation was happening within me. The city below my window, my kingdom, was no longer a symbol of my triumph. It was becoming an indictment of my ignorance. The people I had dismissed as a faceless, inconvenient problem, the human scenery I sped past in my Bentley, were becoming real. Their stories, their pain, their resilience, it was all suddenly, undeniably, real. My own life, with its manufactured dramas and its hollow, repetitive pleasures, felt like a shallow, childish fantasy in comparison. It was into this moment of profound, unsettling reflection that my phone buzzed, a harsh, intrusive sound from another world. I glanced at the screen. It was the group chat. Leon. "What's the holdup, D? Is the old bird gone yet? We're ready to pop some corks and celebrate your disgusting victory. Send proof." The crass, juvenile cruelty of the message, a message that would have seemed perfectly normal to me just a few hours ago, now felt like a punch to the gut. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, acrid taste in the back of my throat. The game, which had seemed like a thrilling, harmless diversion, was now revealed to me for what it was, a grotesque and unforgivable act of cruelty. The crude, triumphant message from Leon glowed on the screen of my phone, a digital testament to the ugly, shallow world I inhabited. I felt a hot, sickening wave of shame wash over me. An hour ago, I would have laughed along with them. I would have felt the familiar, empty thrill of victory. Now, their words felt like an indictment, a confirmation of the spiritual poverty that Martha had so expertly, so gently, revealed to me. I had to look up from my phone and meet her pale, intelligent eyes. She was watching me, her expression unreadable, but I had the distinct feeling that she knew exactly the kind of message I had just received. She had seen it all before. "Your friends are getting impatient, I take it," she said, her voice a simple statement of fact, devoid of judgment. I couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. "They are," I said, my own voice sounding strained and foreign in the quiet, Coltrane-filled room. "They want proof." The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Proof of what? That I had succeeded in a cruel and meaningless game? That I had managed to lure a vulnerable woman into my home for the sport of it? The entire concept, which had seemed like a thrilling, edgy diversion in the cigar smoke haze of the club, now felt like a moral stain I would never be able to wash off. "I see," she said. She took a thoughtful sip of her wine. "And what form exactly must this proof take?" This was the most humiliating moment of my life. I, Darius Kane, a man who moved through the world with an armor of unshakable confidence, was reduced to a stammering, embarrassed schoolboy. "A photograph," I mumbled, my gaze fixed on the floor. "Of you, in my bedroom." I braced myself for her anger, for her disgust, for the righteous fury I so richly deserved. Instead, she laughed. It was not her dry, rattling laugh from the alley. It was a full, throaty, and genuinely amused sound, The sound of a woman who was so far beyond being offended by the foolishness of men that all she had left was a kind of weary, cosmic humor. "Of course," she said, a wry smile playing on her lips. "The sordid, visual evidence. A trophy for the conqueror. You men are so predictable." She set her wineglass down with a soft click. "All right, Darius. I will help you win your disgusting bet. But my participation in this little farce has a price." "Name it," I said instantly, grateful for the simple transactional nature of the request. "Anything." $50,000, she said, her voice calm and clear. The amount was nothing to me, a rounding error in my weekly finances. "And it is not for me," she continued, her eyes suddenly losing their amused glint and becoming as hard and clear as diamonds. "There is a family, a mother, a father, and a 2-year-old baby with a terrible cough, living under the Wacker Drive viaduct. They lost their home 2 months ago. You will take this $50,000 in cash. You will also go to a store, and you will buy everything on a list I'm about to give you. Diapers, formula, antibiotics, warm blankets, new clothes, and you, personally, will deliver all of it to them tomorrow. That is my price." Her condition was a stroke of genius. It was not just a demand for money. It was a demand for my direct personal involvement. She was forcing me to step out of my glass tower and into the shadows I had ignored, to come face to face with the human consequences of the world my friends and I had built. "It's a deal," I said, my voice thick with a strange new emotion. It was a mixture of shame and a profound grudging respect. The scene in my bedroom was one of the most surreal and deeply uncomfortable experiences of my life. The room, with its minimalist decor, its king-sized bed dressed in a $1,000 sheet set, its panoramic view of the city, was a temple to my own sterile, lonely success. And into this temple walked Martha, a woman who owned nothing, yet who seemed to possess a kind of quiet, unshakable power that made all of my possessions feel like cheap, meaningless trinkets. She sat on the edge of my bed, her posture as regal as a queen's, the luxurious silk of my robe pooling around her frail form. "All right, handsome," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Let's get this over with. How do you want this to look? Should I appear frail and conquered? Or perhaps a bit triumphant, as if I've just had my way with you?" The sheer audacity of her humor, the way she was directing this sordid little play, was both staggering and, in a strange way, liberating. I took out my phone, my hands fumbling with the camera. The man my friends thought I was, the ruthless, conquering hero, would have enjoyed this moment. But the man I was becoming felt like a complete and utter fool. I was taking a picture of this wise, powerful, and strangely beautiful woman in my bed, not as an act of conquest, but as an act of profound and utter degradation of myself. I took a single, simple photograph of her sitting on the bed, looking not at me, but out at the city lights, a look of quiet, thoughtful contemplation on her face. It was the least salacious, most dignified image I could manage. I sent it to the group chat with the simple caption, "Pay up." The replies were instantaneous and exactly as crude and juvenile as I had expected. A barrage of fire emojis, a series of locker room jokes. Leon wrote, "The legend. I never doubted you for a second. We're on our way up with the champagne." Their congratulations, which I had so desperately craved, now felt like insults. They were celebrating a victory that felt, to me, like the most profound loss of my life. Martha got off the bed, her dignity perfectly intact. "Well," she said, smoothing out the robe, "I hope your $3 million was worth it." Just then, the private elevator chimed, announcing the arrival of my friends, and I was filled with a deep and all-consuming dread at the thought of having to face them. The chime of the private elevator was an unnervingly cheerful sound, heralding the arrival of the jackals to the feast. I braced myself, a surge of adrenaline and a deep, profound sense of dread washing over me. I wanted to tell them to go away, to leave us in the strange, quiet, and transformative space Martha had created. But the game had to be played to its end. The final ugly act of the farce was about to begin. Leon, Kevin, and Ray burst into the penthouse, their faces flushed with alcohol and the thrill of their cynical sport. Leon was holding a magnum of vintage champagne like a trophy, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. "There he is!" Leon boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The absolute legend. The man who can charm the rags off a beggar. We saw the photo, D. Unbelievable. Now where is she? Did you at least get her to use the service elevator on her way out?" They roared with laughter, a harsh, ugly sound that desecrated the quiet dignity of the Coltrane music still playing softly in the background. Their laughter died in their throats. They stopped dead in the entryway, their triumphant expressions dissolving into a slack-jawed, comical disbelief. The scene before them was not what they had been expecting. They had expected to find me alone, basking in the afterglow of a sordid transactional victory. They had expected the air to be thick with the cheap perfume of a successful conquest. Instead, they found a scene of quiet, unnerving, and utterly baffling decorum. There, sitting calmly in my most expensive Eames armchair, was Martha. She was no longer a disheveled heap of rags. She was a figure of strange and profound dignity, wrapped in my plush silk robe, her clean silver hair tied back neatly. She had a glass of water in one hand, and was calmly paging through a massive $1,000 art book from my coffee table. She was not a victim who had been used and discarded. She was a host, a queen, a person of substance who looked up at their boisterous intrusion with an expression of mild, pitying disappointment, as if they were unruly children who had just interrupted a serious adult conversation. The three of them stood frozen, the magnum of champagne in Leon's hand suddenly looking like a ridiculous, pathetic prop. What the hell is this?" Leon stammered, his bravado evaporating, replaced by a raw, confused uncertainty. Martha placed a bookmark in the art book and closed it with a soft, definitive thud. She looked at the three of them, her pale eyes moving from one foolish face to the next, her gaze a slow, clinical assessment. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and clear, with no trace of the gravelly rasp from the alley. "I do apologize for my state of dress. My own wardrobe is not quite suitable for an evening such as this." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. "Please, don't let me interrupt your celebration." They were speechless. They looked from her to me and back again, their minds struggling to process the scene. They had come here to mock a beggar, to celebrate a cruel joke. They had not come here to be confronted by a woman who possessed more dignity and self-possession in my borrowed bathrobe than they did in their $10,000 suits. "Are you afraid?" Martha asked, her voice soft, but the question was as sharp as a needle. "Is that it? You came here expecting to laugh at me, to feel superior, but now you're just uncomfortable. Are you afraid that poverty might be contagious?" She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Don't worry, it's not. But I find that foolishness often is." She looked at the $3 million that had just been transferred to my account on my phone. "You spend this kind of money on a cruel sport to entertain yourselves for an evening," she said, her voice full of a quiet, profound sorrow, not anger. "You believe this makes you powerful, successful. But do you know what I have learned, living in the invisible city you all fly over? I have learned that the most generous people in this world are the ones who have almost nothing to give. They will share their last cigarette, their only blanket, the second half of their sandwich, without a moment's thought. You," she said, her gaze sweeping over their stunned, ashamed faces, "have everything. And you share nothing but contempt. Now tell me, who are the truly poor ones in this room?" Her words landed in the silent penthouse like stones dropped into a deep, still pond, the ripples of their truth spreading out, touching everything. Leon, Kevin, and Ray, these titans of industry, these masters of the universe, had been completely and utterly silenced by an old woman in a bathrobe. The game was over. The lesson was complete. They mumbled their excuses, their faces flushed with a shame so deep it was almost painful to watch. They made a hasty, awkward retreat, their celebratory champagne left untouched on my marble bar. I stood in the silence after they had gone, the $3 million in my account feeling like a dirty, shameful weight. The bet was over. I had won. But I had never, in my entire life, felt more like a loser. Martha stood up, her movements slow and graceful. "Well," she said, a hint of the wry humor returning to her eyes. "That was educational." She looked at me, at my own shame-filled face. "You have a promise to keep, Darius," she said softly. "A family is waiting for you." And I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling that the simple, charitable act of delivering diapers and formula to a family living under an overpass now felt like the only important, the only meaningful thing I had ever done in my entire empty life. The morning after the bet was a harsh, unforgiving daylight. I woke up in my $1,000 bed, the Chicago sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I was greeted not with the familiar empty satisfaction of a victory, but with the hangover of a profound spiritual defeat. The $3 million from Leon, Kevin, and Ray had been transferred to my account while I slept, a silent, digital monument to my own moral bankruptcy. My penthouse, which had always felt like the pinnacle of my success, now felt like a pristine, sterile tomb, its silence amplifying the hollowness I felt inside. The ghost of Martha, the quiet, powerful woman in my borrowed robe, lingered in every room, her simple, probing questions about my life echoing in the empty space where my pride used to be. I was faced with a promise, a final binding clause in the ugly contract I had made the night before. I had to deliver $50,000 and a car full of supplies to a family living under an overpass. The old Darius, the man I had been just 24 hours ago, would have outsourced the task. I would have had my assistant write a check, hire a delivery service, and insulate myself from the messy, inconvenient reality of actual human suffering. It would have been a simple, tax-deductible transaction. But the man who woke up this morning, the man who had been so thoroughly and quietly dismantled by a homeless woman quoting John Coltrane, knew that was not an option. This was not a transaction. It was a penance, and it was one I had to pay myself. The first step of my penance was a journey into a foreign land, a massive, fluorescent-lit Target store in the middle of a weekday. I, a man whose shopping was confined to the hushed, exclusive boutiques of the Magnificent Mile, felt like an alien navigating a strange and baffling new world. I walked the aisles with Martha's list in my hand, a handwritten scroll of items that were a testament to a life of desperate, practical need. Diapers, baby formula, children's Tylenol, Pedialyte, wool blankets, thermal socks, canned soup. It was a language of survival I did not speak. I, who could debate the merits of a V12 engine versus a V8, had to ask a stock boy, a kid no older than 20, to explain the difference between various types of diaper rash cream. The experience was deeply, profoundly humbling. I loaded up 2 shopping carts with the supplies, my movements clumsy and uncertain. At the checkout, I paid for the mountain of goods with my black Amex card, an act that felt almost profane in its context. Then came the $50,000 in cash. The day before, I had called my private banker and asked him to have the money ready for me, bundled in non-sequential unmarked bills. He had assumed it was for a poker game in Vegas. The look on the young bank teller's face as she counted out the stacks of hundreds was one of awe and a little bit of fear. As I placed the thick, shrink-wrapped brick of cash into a simple grocery bag, I realized that this was simultaneously the most and the least valuable money I had ever held. The final, surreal act was loading all of it into the trunk of my Bentley. The gleaming, hand-polished symbol of my success, a car designed to signal my separation from the masses, was now filled with the humble, life-sustaining necessities of the very people it was meant to impress. The juxtaposition was a powerful visual metaphor for the violent collision of my two worlds. I got into the driver's seat, the scent of new leather mingling with the faint plastic smell of the diapers, and I drove away from the gleaming towers of my world and towards the shadows I had spent my entire life pretending did not exist. The GPS in my Bentley, a calm, British female voice that had guided me to countless high-end restaurants and exclusive business meetings, now directed me to a part of the city I didn't know existed. The gleaming skyscrapers of the Loop gave way to a landscape of decaying warehouses and crumbling infrastructure. The final command, "You have arrived at your destination," was a cruel irony. I had arrived at the underbelly of my own city, a place of shadow and neglect, the Wacker Drive Viaduct. I parked the Bentley, its gleaming black paint and chrome trim a vulgar, ostentatious statement in this world of gray concrete and rust. The car was not just a vehicle. It was an accusation, a spaceship from a planet of obscene wealth that had just landed in a land of profound want. I got out, the $50,000 brick of cash in a humble grocery bag, my expensive suit feeling like a foolish, inappropriate costume. The encampment was a small, fragile city of its own, huddled in the perpetual twilight beneath the massive, roaring artery of the overpass. Tents, cobbled together from tarps and scavenged lumber, leaned against the concrete pillars. A fire burned in a rusted steel drum, its smoke mingling with the damp, chilly air. The people, a dozen or so men and women, stopped what they were doing and turned to watch me. Their faces were a mixture of deep, weary suspicion and a hard-won pride. They were not begging. They were simply observing me, this alien intruder, with the quiet, assessing gaze of a people who had learned that outsiders rarely brought good news. And then I saw her, and here, in her own world, she was yet another woman I had never met. She was not the pathetic victim from the alley. She was not the ironic, intellectual sage from my penthouse. Here, she was Mama Martha, a queen in her own ragged court. She was standing in the center of the small community, directing the distribution of a small donation of day-old bread, her authority quiet, pragmatic, and absolute. A young man with a wild look in his eyes was arguing with an older woman, and Martha placed a calm hand on his arm, her low, steady voice instantly diffusing the tension. The others looked to her for guidance, for comfort, for leadership. She was their matriarch, their anchor in a world that had set them adrift. And I, who had believed myself to be a master of the universe, felt like a boy in the presence of true, unadorned power. She saw me, and her expression did not change. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, and gestured for me to follow her. She led me to a small makeshift tent at the edge of the encampment. Inside, huddled together for warmth under a thin, threadbare blanket, was the family she had told me about. They were young, no older than 30. The father had the haunted, hollowed-out eyes of a man who had been defeated by circumstances beyond his control. The mother was holding a small, sleeping child, a little boy who was wheezing, a faint rattling sound in his chest with every breath. They looked up at me, their faces full of a frightened, wary hope. "This is Darius," Martha said simply. "He's a friend. He's here to help." I stood there, awkward and clumsy, the grocery bags full of supplies, feeling like a ridiculously inadequate offering. I, a man who could command boardrooms and negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was rendered speechless. All my practiced charm, all my smooth, confident lines were useless here. All that was left was the raw, undeniable reality of their suffering and my own obscene privilege. I knelt down, my expensive trousers creasing in the dirt, and I began to unload the supplies. The diapers, the formula, the warm, fleece blankets, the small bottles of children's medicine. Then I held out the grocery bag with the cash. The young mother looked at it, then at me, her eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it was almost painful. "What? What is this?" she whispered. "It's for you," I said, my voice hoarse. "For a place to stay. For a doctor for your son. It's a start." She reached out a trembling hand and took the bag. She looked inside, and a sound, a raw, ragged sob of a relief so absolute it was a form of agony, escaped her lips. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms around my neck, her tears soaking the collar of my silk shirt. "Thank you," she wept. "Oh, God. Thank you." I was frozen for a moment, and then I awkwardly put my own arms around her, patting her back, a gesture of comfort that felt both alien and deeply, fundamentally right. In that moment, something inside me broke. The $50,000, the dirty, shameful price for a cruel joke, had just been transformed into a miracle. It had been laundered, not by a bank, but by an act of human grace. The profound, aching emptiness that had been my constant companion for years was suddenly filled with a new, unfamiliar, and overwhelming emotion. It was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was a deep, resonant sense of purpose, of connection, of a shared and profound humanity. I had spent my entire life acquiring things: cars, houses, money, power, and yet, this single act of giving, this simple, direct human connection, was the first thing that had ever made me feel truly rich. I looked over at Martha, who was watching us, a quiet, knowing smile on her face. And I knew that this was the real lesson. This was the true nature of the game I had stumbled into. After the supplies had been distributed, and the young family had been settled with a new, fierce hope in their eyes, I sought out Martha. I found her sitting on an overturned milk crate by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of what smelled like weak, smoky tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows from the concrete pillars of the overpass. The raw, chaotic energy of the encampment had settled into a quiet evening rhythm. I stood before her, no longer a wealthy benefactor or a curious tourist, but a humbled student before his teacher. The suit I was wearing felt like a ridiculous costume, a relic from a life I no longer recognized as my own. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate, "for showing me this." She looked up at me, her pale eyes seeming to hold the fading light of the day. "I didn't show you anything you couldn't have seen for yourself, Darius," she said, her voice a low, gravelly hum. "You just never bothered to look." But why? The question that had been burning in my mind finally came out. Why do you do this? Why do you live like this? You're not like them. You're different. You're educated. You're brilliant. You could be anything you want. Why choose this? She took a slow sip of her tea, considering my question. "Everyone out here has a story of how they fell," she said softly. "A lost job, a medical bill, a bad choice, a broken heart. They fall, and the world makes it almost impossible to get back up. My story is just the opposite. I didn't fall. I jumped." She looked out at the small, fragile community around her, her gaze full of a fierce, protective love. "I had a life before this one. A life with beautiful gilded walls. But I learned that sometimes the most beautiful walls make the strongest cage." "Here," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "I have nothing. No walls, no possessions, no name that matters to the world outside. And so, I am completely and utterly free." Her words were a riddle I couldn't yet solve, but they resonated with a deep, profound truth that I was just beginning to understand. My own life was nothing but a series of beautiful gilded walls, and I had never felt more imprisoned. She then turned her piercing gaze back to me, and she turned the question around. "The real question isn't about me, Darius. It's about you. You have your $3 million, your prize for your clever little game. What are you going to do with it now?" Her voice was not accusatory, but it was heavy with a challenge. "Are you going to buy another shiny car to distract you from the emptiness? A new watch to help you mark the passage of your hollow days? Or are you finally going to build something that matters?" The drive back to my penthouse was a journey through a city I had never seen before. I had lived in Chicago my entire life, but I had only ever seen the version that was presented in glossy magazines. Now, I saw the other city, the invisible city Martha had described. I saw the shadows cast by my own glittering world. I saw the people huddled in doorways, the faces of the men and women asking for change at the intersections, faces I had always trained myself not to see. They were no longer a faceless, inconvenient problem. They were Samuel, the history teacher. They were Maria, the runaway. They were the young family with the sick child. They were human. When I stepped back into my penthouse, the contrast was a violent, physical shock. The vast empty space, the cold marble, the soulless modern art. It all seemed grotesque, an obscene monument to a life of profound and utter isolation. I walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city, at the beautiful, perfect machine. But I could no longer unsee the shadows. My home, my castle, no longer felt like a symbol of my success. It felt like a prison, a lonely tower from which I had observed the world without ever once touching it, without ever once being a part of it. Martha's challenge echoed in the silent, empty room. "Are you finally going to build something that matters?" I looked at my reflection in the dark glass, The glittering city spread out behind me like a borrowed backdrop. And for the first time, I saw the man I had become. A bored, empty, and profoundly lonely king of a meaningless kingdom. I looked at the banking app on my phone. The $3 million from the bet sat there, a dirty, shameful number. It was the ugliest money I had ever made. But Martha, in her infinite wisdom, had not just shown me my own spiritual poverty. She had shown me a path to redemption. She had shown me how to launder this money, not through a bank, but through an act of grace. The decision, when it came, was not a struggle. It was a surrender. A surrender to the new, powerful sense of purpose that had taken root in my soul. I picked up my phone. I did not call my friends to brag about my winnings. I did not call my car dealer to order a new toy. I scrolled through my contacts to a name I usually only called for business deals and tax shelters. Ray, my lawyer, my friend. He answered on the second ring. "Darius," he said, his voice wary, no doubt still smarting from Martha's lecture. "What's up?" "Ray," I said, and my own voice sounded unfamiliar to me, firm, clear, and full of a purpose I had never felt before. "I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the month. I need you to help me set something up." "Set what up?" Ray asked. "Another shell corporation?" "No," I said, looking out at the vast, sprawling city with its countless shadows. "Something new. I want to start a charitable foundation. I have the seed money." The week following my visit to the encampment was the most focused and energized of my life. The profound, gnawing boredom that had been the defining feature of my existence was gone, replaced by a clear and all-consuming purpose. I converted a section of my sprawling, minimalist penthouse into a war room. The expensive abstract art was taken down, replaced by whiteboards covered in flowcharts and research notes. I was a man possessed. I spent 18 hours a day on the phone, not with car dealers or stockbrokers, but with nonprofit consultants, urban policy experts, and the heads of community outreach programs in the city's most neglected neighborhoods. I was learning a new language, the language of social impact, of grant proposals, of sustainable charity. My friends, Leon and the others, tried to reach me, their texts a mixture of confusion and mockery. "Heard you've gone soft, D," Leon wrote. "Playing with the poor people now?" I didn't bother to reply. They were ghosts from a past life, their voices the faint, meaningless chatter of a world I no longer inhabited. My entire focus was on building the foundation, on turning the dirty, shameful money from the bet into something clean and good. I was driven by a deep, urgent need to be worthy of the lesson Martha had taught me, to prove to her, and to myself, that the spark of humanity she had seen in me was not a fleeting illusion. It was in the midst of this new, purposeful chaos that the message arrived. It was an anonymous, encrypted text, containing only 3 words and a time. Alinea. 8 p.m. My heart gave a strange, unexpected jolt. Alinea. It was not just a restaurant. It was a legend, a temple of avant-garde cuisine with a months-long waiting list and a price tag that was astronomical even by my standards. It was the ultimate symbol of the excessive, decadent world I was now so desperately trying to leave behind. My first thought was that it was a prank from Leon, a cynical attempt to lure me back into their world. But the tone of the message felt different. It was not boastful or juvenile. It was quiet, authoritative, and deeply intriguing. A second message came through a minute later. "It will be worth your while. Come alone." I made a decision. I would go. I was a man following a strange new path, and this felt like a clue, a signpost I could not afford to ignore. That evening, I put on a suit, the familiar armor of my old life, but it felt different now, less like a symbol of my power and more like a costume. I drove to the restaurant, not in the Bentley, but in a simple, anonymous sedan from one of my dealerships, and walked into the hushed, reverent space, a visitor in a world that had once been my own. The interior of Alinea was less a restaurant and more a work of performance art. The lighting was low and dramatic, the decor minimalist and severe. It was a space designed to intimidate, to make you feel as though you were not merely dining, but participating in an exclusive, almost sacred, ritual. The hostess led me through a series of quiet, hushed rooms to a secluded table in a private alcove, a bubble of silence and isolation. I sat down. The silence of the restaurant, a strange and unsettling echo of the silence in my own, transformed life. I had no idea what to expect. I was a man caught between two worlds, the cynical, empty world of my past and the new, purposeful world I was trying to build. This felt like a moment where those two worlds were about to collide. I waited for 10 minutes, my mind racing through a list of possibilities. Was it Leon, having devised another, more elaborate and cruel game? Was it a business rival? Was it someone connected to the foundation? A wealthy philanthropist who had heard of my new venture and wanted to test my sincerity? I was so lost in my own thoughts that I didn't notice her approach until she was standing beside my table. I looked up, and for a moment, I was completely speechless. The woman standing before me was, without exaggeration, one of the most beautiful and elegant women I had ever seen. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with a timeless aristocratic grace that seemed to radiate from her. Her skin was the color of warm mahogany, her silver hair styled in an elegant, sophisticated chignon. She wore a simple, exquisitely tailored black dress, and a single strand of perfectly matched pearls graced her neck. She was the very picture of old money, of quiet power, of a world of privilege so profound it had no need to announce itself. I assumed there had been a mistake, that the hostess had seated her at the wrong table. "I'm sorry," I began, starting to stand up. "I think you may have the wrong—" My words died in my throat. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and she looked at me. And I saw her eyes. They were the same pale, startlingly intelligent, and slightly amused blue eyes that had looked up at me from under a tattered scarf in a cold, dirty alleyway. They were the eyes that had watched me with a pitying wisdom in my own penthouse. It was impossible. It was madness. But it was her. The world seemed to tilt and spin, the elegant, minimalist restaurant dissolving into a blur of confusion. "Martha?" I whispered, my voice a hoarse, strangled sound. The woman's smile widened. "Not exactly," she said, her voice no longer the gravelly rasp of the street, but a smooth, cultured, and deeply resonant alto, the voice of a woman who was accustomed to being listened to. She sat down in the chair opposite me, her movements a study in effortless grace. "My name is Vivian," she said, placing a small, elegant clutch on the table. "Vivian Dubois." Dubois. The name was a thunderclap in the quiet restaurant. It was a name that was legendary in Chicago, in the country. The Dubois family was a dynasty, a multi-generational empire of banking, media, and real estate, one of the oldest, most powerful, and wealthiest black families in America. It was a name synonymous with a level of wealth and influence that made my own considerable fortune look like a child's allowance. I stared at her, my mind struggling to reconcile the two realities, the filthy, hunched figure from the alley, and the impossibly elegant, aristocratic billionaire sitting before me. "But you're dead," I stammered, the words sounding foolish as soon as I said them. I remembered the headlines from 5 years ago. Vivian Dubois, the brilliant, beautiful, and reclusive sole heiress to the Dubois fortune, lost at sea. Her sailboat capsized in a sudden storm on Lake Michigan. Her body was never found. "Reports of my death," she said with a dry, ironic smile, "were greatly exaggerated. Or rather, they were expertly fabricated with the help of a few very loyal and very well-paid people." She then proceeded to tell me her story, and it was a tale so extraordinary, so full of pain and courage, that my own recent drama seemed like a trivial farce in comparison. She spoke of her marriage to a man from a family as powerful as her own, a celebrated public figure who was, in the privacy of their home, a violent, controlling monster. She told me of the beatings, of the psychological abuse, of the gilded cage she had lived in for 15 years. She explained that a conventional divorce was impossible. Her husband was too powerful, too connected. He would have used his influence to destroy her, to paint her as mentally unstable, to ensure he kept control of her fortune and her life. So, she had devised a different plan, a plan of breathtaking audacity. She had faked her own death. She had walked away from a multi-billion-dollar inheritance, from her name, from her entire identity, to achieve the one thing her money could not buy her: freedom. But why, why homelessness? I asked, my mind still reeling. You could have gone anywhere, been anyone. To truly disappear, she explained, her gaze intense. To become invisible to people who have the power to scan every database, to track every credit card, to find anyone, anywhere in the world. You have to become someone the world refuses to see. You have to become a ghost. And who is more invisible in this country than a poor, old, homeless woman? It was the perfect disguise. It was the only way to be truly, absolutely free. I sat there in stunned silence, the pieces of the last 2 weeks clicking into place, forming a picture that was both terrifying and magnificent. The woman I had pitied, the woman I had made a cruel and vulgar bet on, was not a beggar. She was a queen in a self-imposed exile, a woman who had given up everything the world values in order to reclaim the one thing that truly matters: her own soul. I sat across from the most remarkable woman I had ever met, my mind a kaleidoscope of fractured, unbelievable images. The hunched figure in the alley, the quiet sage in my penthouse, and the aristocratic billionaire heiress who now sat before me. The three women were one, and my entire understanding of the world, of wealth, of poverty, of identity itself, had been completely and irrevocably shattered. The oysters and champagne sat untouched on the table between us. My appetite for the empty luxuries of my old life was gone, replaced by a deep, burning hunger for understanding. Why? I finally managed to ask, my voice a hoarse whisper. Why me? Of all the arrogant, foolish, rich men in this city, why choose me for this elaborate, life-altering lesson? Vivian. It was still difficult to think of her as Vivian. Took a sip of her water, her gaze direct and unflinching. It was not as random as you might think, Darius, she began, her voice a calm, steady rhythm. My life as Martha is a life of observation. For 5 years, I have been the invisible ghost at the feast of this city's excess. The alley behind that restaurant? It is one of my regular spots. The dumpsters there are a veritable treasure trove of gourmet food. She said this without a trace of self-pity, as a simple statement of fact. I had heard your group there before. Leon with his loud, cruel games. Ray with his weak, complicit laughter. Kevin with his nervous, fearful silence. And you. What about me? I asked. You were always the most interesting, she said, her head tilted in a gesture of clinical assessment. Your friends are simply empty. They are hollow men, their souls consumed by their own greed. There is nothing left inside them to save. But you were different. You were just as arrogant, just as cruel. But underneath it all, there was a profound boredom. And boredom, I have learned, is often just another name for a soul that is starving to death. I saw a man who was rattling the bars of his own beautiful gilded cage. I thought that maybe, just maybe, if someone gave you the right key, you might actually have the courage to use it to get out. She had seen the truth of my existence more clearly from a dirty alleyway than I had from my 95th floor penthouse. She had diagnosed the sickness in my soul, a sickness I had been treating with the cheap medicine of fast cars and easy women. The bet that night was particularly ugly, she continued, and I decided I was tired of listening to the spiritual ugliness of your world. So I chose to intervene. I had intended only to teach you a simple lesson in humility, to make you and your friends feel small and foolish. But then, you brought me to your home. And in our conversation, I saw that my initial assessment was correct. There was something in you worth saving. A flicker of shame. A capacity for change. So, I decided to escalate the lesson. She reached down and picked up the elegant leather clutch that had been sitting on the chair beside her. She placed it on the table and opened it. She did not pull out a wallet or a tube of lipstick. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder and slid it across the table to me. I opened it. Inside was not just a list of contacts. It was a complete, meticulously researched, and brilliantly conceived business plan for a high-impact, national charitable foundation. There were detailed strategies for urban renewal projects, for homeless outreach programs, for educational scholarships. There were letters of introduction to the heads of the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, to senators, to the most powerful and effective philanthropists in the country. Tucked into the back of the folder was a single, simple cashier's check, drawn from a discreet, anonymous Swiss trust. It was made out to the Darius Kane Foundation. The amount was for $10 million. I stared at the check, at the impossible, life-altering number, and then back at her, speechless. "You have the heart for this work now, Darius," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just giving you a better blueprint. That $3 million you won from your friends, consider it the first round of public funding." She then stood up, her movement a signal that our time and her lesson was over. "And now," she said, her tone becoming serious, final, "you must promise me something." Vivian Dubois died in a storm on Lake Michigan 5 years ago. The world must continue to believe that. My freedom, my very life, depends on my anonymity as Martha. You will never try to find me. You will never speak of Vivian again. Do you understand? I could only nod, my mind still reeling from the sheer, staggering magnitude of who she was, of what she had done, of what she was now giving me. "Yes," I managed to say. "I understand." "Good," she said. She extended a hand, and I took it. Her grip was firm and strong. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Kane." And then she turned and walked away. I watched as she moved through the exclusive, opulent restaurant, a queen moving through a world she had renounced. And then she was gone, disappearing back into the shadows, back into her secret, chosen life. I was left alone at the table with a $10 million check and a blueprint for a new life. The empty, bored man who had walked into this restaurant an hour ago was gone forever. In his place was a man who had been given a purpose, a mission, a second chance, by the most unlikely, the most magnificent angel he could have ever imagined. 5 years is a lifetime. Or, in my case, it is the span of an entirely new and different life. The man I had been, the arrogant, bored king of a gilded cage, was a stranger to me now, a ghost from a past so distant it felt like it had belonged to someone else. The Darius Kane who now walked the streets of Chicago was a different man, a man who had been fundamentally remade, not in a boardroom, but in a dirty alleyway and a homeless encampment under an overpass. The years following my encounter with Vivian Dubois had been a period of profound and purposeful demolition and reconstruction, not of buildings, but of my own soul. The Darius Kane Foundation became the central organizing principle of my existence. Fueled by the winnings from my shameful bet, Vivian's staggering anonymous donation, and the powerful connections she had gifted me, the foundation grew into one of the most effective and respected philanthropic forces in the city. We didn't just write checks. We were on the ground, building shelters, funding job training programs, creating pathways out of the invisible city of shadows that I had once been so blind to. I was not a distant, aloof chairman. I was a hands-on, daily presence. I knew the names of the shelter managers, the stories of the families we helped, the quiet, daily struggles and triumphs of the people I had once dismissed as a faceless, inconvenient problem. My old life, with all its glittering, empty trappings, was systematically dismantled. The Bentley was the first thing to go, sold at auction with the proceeds going directly into the Foundation's general fund. I now drove a simple, reliable American-made sedan, a vehicle that was not a statement, but a tool. The sprawling, sterile penthouse, my lonely glass tower, was sold next. I moved into a comfortable, warm, and much smaller apartment in a quiet, historic neighborhood, a place that felt like a home, not a gallery. The art, the expensive furniture, the entire apparatus of my former life was liquidated. Every dollar poured back into the work that now gave my life its meaning. My old friends, my partners in boredom and cynicism, had faded away. Our worlds no longer aligned. Our languages were no longer the same. I heard stories of them, of Leon's latest, more reckless gamble, of Kevin's nervous, unhappy accumulation of more wealth, of Ray's continued defense of the morally bankrupt. They were still playing the same empty games, and I could only look back on their world with a profound sense of pity and a deep, shuddering gratitude for the cruel bet that had, in the end, saved me from it. My life was no longer about acquiring. It was about giving. And in giving, I had received something far more valuable than anything I had ever owned: a purpose. I honored my promise. In the 5 years since that staggering, life-altering night at Alinea, I never once tried to find her. I never hired a private investigator. I never visited the encampment under the viaduct, knowing that to do so would be a selfish intrusion, a violation of the sacred anonymity she had so brilliantly and bravely carved out for herself. For all the world knew, Vivienne Dubois was a ghost, a tragic memory, a name etched on a cenotaph in a quiet, respectable cemetery. But for me, she was the most real and vital presence in my life. She was a ghost who was very much alive, a silent, invisible partner in the new life I was building. She became my conscience, my moral compass. I would find myself in the middle of a board meeting for the foundation, debating the merits of a new housing initiative or the allocation of a multi-million-dollar grant, and I would pause and ask myself a simple question. What would Martha do? The answer was always the same. She would choose the path of greatest compassion, of greatest human impact, of quiet, unadorned dignity. She was the North Star by which I navigated the complex, often cynical, world of philanthropy. Sometimes, I would think I saw her. I would be at the opening of a new shelter in a forgotten neighborhood, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras, and I would see a flicker of her in the crowd, a flash of pale, intelligent blue eyes in the face of an old woman sipping soup in the corner, a dry, wry smile on the lips of a volunteer who looked at me with a knowing, unimpressed gaze. These were just tricks of the light, of a mind that was forever searching for the woman who had saved it. But these moments served as a constant, humbling reminder of the truth she had taught me, that the most extraordinary souls are often hidden in the most ordinary of vessels. My relationship with Ray, the only one of my old friends who had managed to cross the chasm into my new life, was different now. He handled all the foundation's legal work, pro bono, a quiet act of his own penance. One evening, we were sharing a simple beer at a neighborhood bar after a long day of meetings, a world away from the bourbon and cigars of our past. "You know," he said, looking at me with a kind of quiet wonder, "I still can't get over it sometimes. The man I knew, the guy who made that bet, he's just gone. It's like you're a completely different person." I took a sip of my beer and thought about his words. "That man didn't die, Ray," I said after a moment. "He was just asleep, living a life so loud and so bright he couldn't see how dark and empty it was inside." I thought of Vivienne, of the impossible choice she had made. "I met a woman who owned billions," I continued, my voice soft. "And she taught me that she only became truly rich when she gave it all away. I'm just following her business model. It turns out," I said with a small, genuine smile, "the more you give away, the more you actually have." It was the fundamental, paradoxical truth that now guided my life. The acquisition of wealth had left me empty, but the distribution of it had made me whole. Vivienne had not just taught me a lesson in social justice, she had taught me the true meaning of wealth. It was not a number in a bank account. It was not a collection of expensive toys. True wealth was purpose. It was connection. It was the ability to look at the world and see not a kingdom to be conquered, but a community to be served. It was a freedom from the prison of your own ego. Vivienne, in her rags and her anonymity, was the richest, freest person I had ever known. My gratitude for her, for the incredible, risky, and profoundly compassionate act of her lesson, was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of my new life. It was a debt I could never repay, except by living the life she had shown me was possible, a life of meaning, a life that mattered. The 5-year anniversary gala for the Darius Kane Foundation was held not in a sterile, exclusive club on the 95th floor, but in the beautifully restored grand ballroom of a historic building in the heart of one of the neighborhoods we served. The room was not filled with my old, cynical friends, but with a vibrant, eclectic mix of humanity. Community leaders, dedicated social workers, the proud, smiling faces of families who had been given a second chance, and the new, genuine friends I had made on my journey. The air was thick with the sounds of a live jazz band, of heartfelt speeches, and of real, unrestrained laughter. It was a celebration not of wealth, but of what wealth, when guided by purpose and compassion, could achieve. I stood on a balcony overlooking the crowded room, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. I was no longer a man who needed the burn of bourbon to feel alive. My life was now a quiet, steady fire, fueled by the daily, challenging, and profoundly fulfilling work of my foundation. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw a notification light up my phone. It was a photo, tagged by a mutual acquaintance on social media. It was Leon. He was standing on the deck of a new, even more ostentatious yacht, a bottle of champagne in his hand, a forced, practiced smile on his face. He looked older, heavier, and in his eyes, I saw the same profound and soul-crushing boredom that had once been my own constant companion. He was still in the gilded cage. He was still playing the same empty games. I felt a wave, not of anger or of judgment, but of a deep and sorrowful pity. And then I put the phone away, turning my back on the ghost of my past and focusing on the vibrant, hopeful present before me. A young woman, a recipient of one of our university scholarships, the first in her family to go to college, caught my eye from across the room and raised her glass to me in a silent, grateful toast. I smiled and raised my own glass back to her, and in that simple, quiet exchange, I felt a sense of fulfillment more profound than any multi-million-dollar deal I had ever closed. I thought back to that night, 5 years ago, to the cruel, cynical bet made in a cloud of cigar smoke. To my old friends, that night was now just a hazy, drunken memory, a legendary story of how Darius Kane had won $3 million in the most audacious way imaginable. They saw the end result, the foundation, the good works, and they likely assumed, in their shallow transactional world, that I had simply used my winnings to build a new, more respectable monument to my own ego. They could never understand the truth. I smiled to myself, a quiet, knowing smile that was just for me. The truth was, I hadn't won the bet that night. I had lost, spectacularly, the moment Martha had looked me in the eye and seen the pathetic, foolish boy behind the expensive suit. The real wager, the one that had truly mattered, had not been mine at all. It had been hers. Vivian, in her infinite, mysterious wisdom, had made a quiet bet of her own. She had looked at a spiritually bankrupt, arrogant, and empty man, and she had wagered that a spark of humanity still existed within him. She had gambled that his soul was not a lost cause, that it could, with the right, shocking, and compassionate intervention, be redeemed. Her wager had not been for $3 million. It had been for a human life. My life. And she, in her magnificent silent way, had won. The money, the foundation, the new life. It was not the prize. It was simply the proof of her victory. I never saw her again. I did not know if she was still Martha, the quiet queen of the city's shadows, or if she had become someone else entirely, a new ghost in a new city. But it didn't matter. Her lesson, her legacy, was not in her presence, but in my actions. It was in the warm beds of the shelters we had built, in the futures of the students we had sent to college, in the hope we had brought to the darkest corners of the city. I looked out at the celebration, at the beautiful, messy, and vibrant tapestry of the community I was now a part of. The king in the lonely glass tower was gone. In his place was a humble, grateful, and profoundly wealthy man, and I finally, truly, understood the lesson Vivian had taught me that night. True wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what you give away. And the greatest fortune of all is a life of purpose.